He sat quietly, accused of a crime he didn't commit, waiting for the inevitable. But when the judge learned who he really was, the case became something no one in that courtroom would ever forget. The courtroom was silent, save for the slow, rhythmic tapping of Judge Evelyn Carrington's gavel against the polished wood of her bench. Each tap echoed through the chamber, a steady metronome counting down another case moving through the relentless gears of the justice system. The air felt dense, saturated with the fatigue of 1,000 cases that had come before, some tragic, others infuriating, most exhausting in their predictability. But this one was supposed to be routine. Seated at the defense table was Darius Anthony Caldwell, a 17-year-old black teenager. He sat unervingly still, his back straight, his gaze fixed dead ahead. His face was unreadable, his hands resting calmly on the table in front of him. He was charged with trespassing and petty theft. Minor infractions on paper, nothing violent, nothing extraordinary. Judge Carrington barely glanced at him as she skimmed the contents of the file before her. The prosecutor's claims were simple enough. Darius had been caught inside a condemned warehouse, allegedly stealing copper wire. He was arrested by an officer who claimed Darius had no business being there. Standard stuff. The prosecutor, Stanley Whitaker, had already launched into his opening argument. A wiry man with sharp features and a voice that grated like sandpaper, Whitaker leaned into his podium, his tone clipped and unforgiving. "This isn't about a harmless mistake," Whitaker said, his voice slicing through the stillness. "It's about accountability. If we keep excusing this kind of behavior, what message are we sending? That anyone can just break into private property and take what they want?" The defense attorney, Marlene Ortiz, sighed audibly and flipped open her own file. "Your Honor, the building in question was abandoned. No private owner, no security, no reported damages, and no stolen property recovered." Whitaker didn't miss a beat. "Doesn't change the fact that he was there illegally." Judge Carrington inhaled quietly. Her eyes drifted to Darius for the first time since the hearing began. This was the part that always troubled her. Young black defendants caught in the system before they even had a chance. Some were troublemakers. Some were unlucky. Some were guilty of little more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She studied Darius Caldwell now, expecting to see what she always did: fear, defiance, exhaustion. But he didn't fidget. He didn't glare. He didn't look afraid. His face was composed. His eyes steady, almost patient. That was unusual. Carrington leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice calm and measured, "do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, ma'am," Darius replied, his tone respectful, controlled. "No hesitation. And you were in the warehouse?" "Yes, ma'am." His directness caught her off guard. She had expected excuses or denial, some hurried justification. Marlene Ortiz cleared her throat. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to explain why he was there." Carrington held up a hand. "I want to hear it from him." She studied Darius's face. "Why were you there?" For the first time, Darius shifted. He tilted his head slightly, his dark brown eyes locking with hers. Carrington felt a strange hesitation, hers, not his. It was a prickle of something unfamiliar at the back of her mind. "I was doing my job," Darius said plainly. The defense attorney stiffened beside him. Whitaker frowned. Carrington straightened in her seat. "Your job," she repeated carefully. "Yes, ma'am." A murmur rippled faintly through the courtroom gallery. Just a whisper of confusion, but Carrington noticed. Whitaker gave a humorless chuckle. "You mean trespassing? Theft?" "No, that you son serventi. I mean my real job." The tension in the room thickened. Carrington kept her expression neutral, but her fingers tightened around her gavel. "What exactly is your real job, Mr. Caldwell?" Darius held her gaze for a long moment. Then he smiled faint, knowing, "Maybe you should ask the officer who arrested me." Before Carrington could speak again, the heavy courtroom doors creaked open. The sound sliced through the tension like a blade. Every head turned. Detective Nathaniel Briggs entered, his badge glinting beneath the fluorescent lights. Briggs was a veteran, His reputation for being no-nonsense and precise preceded him. He rarely attended hearings unless something serious was unfolding. Carrington's jaw tightened. "Detective Briggs, is there a reason you're interrupting my courtroom?" Briggs didn't flinch. He moved with purpose toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm and level. "There's something you need to know before this case proceeds." Whitaker bristled. "This is highly irregular. We're in the middle of a trial." Briggs ignored him. His gaze settled on Carrington. "There's been a misunderstanding regarding Mr. Caldwell's identity." A heavy silence blanketed the room. Carrington narrowed her eyes. "Misunderstanding?" Darius remained seated, exhaling quietly through his nose, his hands folded in front of him as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Briggs drew in a breath. "Darius Caldwell isn't a suspect," he said slowly. "He's one of us." For a moment, no one breathed. Shock spread across the courtroom. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Ortiz blinked in disbelief. "Wait, what?" Carrington leaned forward. "Detective Briggs, clarify your statement." "Now." Briggs glanced at Darius, who gave him a brief nod. "Darius Caldwell is an undercover officer," Briggs said. "Part of an internal investigation into racial profiling and systemic bias within law enforcement. His arrest wasn't supposed to happen." Gasps filled the gallery. Someone in the back covered their mouth. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Carrington's pulse pounded in her ears. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "this young man is an officer?" Darius finally spoke again, his voice steady. "I work for the Bureau of Internal Affairs. Intelligence Division. My assignment was to document how suspects like me are treated during routine stops and arrests." Whitaker let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "You expect us to believe a 17-year-old is working undercover? That's absurd." Darius didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his hoodie and retrieved a folded document. "You don't have to believe me. It's all here." Briggs stepped forward, took the document, and handed it to Judge Carrington. She unfolded it. Official letterhead, clearance signatures, valid credentials. It was legitimate. She inhaled slowly. Why wasn't the court informed? Briggs shifted his stance. Because he was never supposed to be arrested. The officer who detained him wasn't briefed. We planned for him to be processed discreetly to observe the system's treatment of black suspects in minor cases. But something went wrong. Ortiz shook her head, her initial shock giving way to anger. "So, the arresting officer didn't even verify his identity?" Briggs said nothing. Darius's voice was quiet but clear. "That's kind of the point, isn't it?" Carrington sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't a case anymore. This was something far larger. But before anyone could fully absorb the revelation, Whitaker slammed his hands onto the table. The sharp crack echoed through the room. "This is outrageous!" Whitaker barked. "An undercover officer, excuse me, a child, is thrown into the system like any other suspect, and we're just supposed to what? Dismiss the charges? Take his word for it." Briggs's jaw tightened. "This isn't about taking anyone's word. It's about facts. Darius Caldwell isn't a criminal. His arrest was a mistake." Whitaker shook his head, laughter devoid of humor. "Then why was he there in the first place?" He turned to Darius, his gaze sharp. "You say you were doing your job. What job? Playing dress-up as a street kid?" Ortiz stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Enough." "No," Whitaker pressed, ignoring her. "Because what this really looks like is a kid with a badge playing gotcha with the justice system. You think embedding a minor into situations like this proves something? What were you hoping to uncover?" Darius leaned forward slightly. "Nothing," he said simply. "Just the truth." Whitaker scoffed. "The truth? And what truth is that?" Darius exhaled. His voice was calm but heavy. "That in a courtroom like this, a kid like me is guilty the moment he walks through the door." The words hung, heavy and undeniable. Carrington felt something twist inside her chest. Whitaker's voice was sharp but less sure now. "You were caught trespassing." The officer had probable cause. Darius tilted his head. "Did he?" The question felt heavier than anything else said that day. Carrington cleared her throat. Detective Briggs, she said carefully. This investigation. What exactly were you investigating? Briggs took a breath. Your Honor, Darius wasn't just observing police procedures. He was gathering data on racial disparities in law enforcement treatment. The courtroom murmured again. Whitaker crossed his arms. And you thought the best way to do that was to put a child in danger. I wasn't in danger, Darius replied, his voice unwavering. I was watching, listening, documenting. Carrington tapped her fingers against the bench. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the existence of such an undercover operation, or how right Darius was. She glanced down at the case file. She had barely glanced at it before this hearing. She had barely looked at him. How many times had she done that before? Darius noticed her expression. I know what this looks like, he said quietly. You don't have to say it. I see it every time I sit in one of these chairs. Same story. Same script. He paused. I just wanted to see if the ending could ever change. Carrington's breath caught in her throat. But before she could speak, a voice from a jury box broke the silence. This is unreal, murmured Lisa Monroe, a middle-aged woman seated in the front row. Are we really saying this officer was thrown into the system just to see how badly it would treat him? Darius met her gaze. Not just me. There were others before me. Others after me. Some without a badge. Lisa stared down at her hands. Jesus. Whitaker rolled his eyes. Oh, please. This isn't some conspiracy. He got arrested because he broke the law. Ortiz glared at him. Did he? He was arrested without evidence of theft in an abandoned building. No charges from an owner. Yet you were ready to convict. Carrington looked at Detective Briggs. Is there documentation for this? Briggs handed over a file. Every detail. She scanned it quickly. Legitimate. Undeniable. Ortiz's voice cut through her thoughts. In light of this, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges. Carrington's gaze returned to Darius. His face was unreadable once more. She set down the file and took a breath. Motion granted. The courtroom rippled with murmurs. Darius stood. No brating. No es mirk. He straightened his hoodie and nodded to himself. As he turned to leave, Carrington spoke again. Officer Caldwell. He stopped and faced her. You believe the system can change? His reply was instant. I believe people can. She nodded slowly. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. And as Darius Caldwell walked out of that courtroom, Judge Carrington realized that maybe, for the first time in her career, she did too.